If you marry her without a prenup, you will never run this company again.
If you marry her without a prenup, you will never run this company again. The champagne glass was still in his hand when she said it. And the whole room went cold. Enzo Bellani had just watched the woman he loved say yes. He had just slid a ring onto her finger right there in his penthouse living room, with the Chicago skyline blazing gold behind them through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and his heart was still hammering in his chest from the joy of it. But then his mother opened her mouth, and just like that, the most beautiful moment of his life cracked right down the middle. "Mama." His voice dropped low like he was trying to keep the moment from shattering completely, because he could already feel it slipping. "Not tonight, please." But Nadia Bellani did not do please. She set her glass down on the marble counter with a soft, deliberate clink, the kind of sound that meant she had already made up her mind, and she folded her hands in front of her like she was closing a meeting. She was 62 years old, dressed in a deep navy wrap dress, silver locks pinned back with quiet elegance, and eyes so sharp they could separate truth from performance in under 5 seconds. She had built the Bellani Group from a single freight truck and sheer stubbornness, and right now, she was looking at her son the way she looked at bad contracts, like something needed to be canceled. "I mean every word, Enzo." Nadia said it quietly, so quietly it was almost gentle. But it wasn't gentle at all. Enzo turned to look at Sienna. She was standing a few feet away, still holding the champagne flute, still wearing the ring, but the smile on her face had changed. It hadn't disappeared exactly, but it had shifted into something harder to read, something tucked away behind her eyes where he couldn't quite reach it. And Sienna Caruso was, without question, a woman worth looking at twice. She was 27, with deep olive skin, thick dark hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and full lips that curved into a smile so warm it made strangers feel like they already knew her. She had a way of walking into a room and making everyone in it feel chosen. That was exactly how she had made Enzo feel 4 months ago, on a rooftop bar in River North. Like out of everyone in the world, she had chosen him. But tonight, standing in his penthouse under the weight of his mother's stare, something about that warmth felt just slightly off, like a candle flickering in a room with no wind. Enzo turned back to his mother, and his jaw tightened. Because Enzo Bellani was not a man who backed down easily. He was 29 years old, 6'2", with a lean and powerfully built frame that carried itself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. His skin was a rich, warm caramel, his fade cut clean and precise at the sides, with soft, dark coils on top and a perfectly shaped goatee that gave his already striking face a maturity that went beyond his age. He had taken his mother's mid-size logistics company and tripled its value before his 28th birthday. He was not naive. He was not reckless. But he was in love. And love, as it turns out, has a way of making even the sharpest men go just a little blind. "Mama, you don't even know her," Enzo said, his voice steady but strained, because he was working hard to hold it together. "I know enough," Nadia replied, and her eyes moved slowly, deliberately, to Sienna, not with hatred. With something far more dangerous, recognition. Enough. Enzo let out a short breath and set his own glass down because his hand wasn't as steady as he wanted it to be. "You've known her for 40 minutes. And in those 40 minutes, Nadia said, tilting her head just slightly, "she has not asked me a single question about you. Not one. Every question she asked was about the company." The room went very still. Sienna's smile didn't waver, but her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the champagne flute, so slightly that only someone watching for it would notice. Enzo noticed, but he told himself it meant nothing. "Mama, that's not fair," he said, because he needed to believe that. "No, Enzo." Nadia's voice dropped even lower now, and for the first time tonight something behind her eyes cracked open just a little. Not weakness, pain. The kind of pain that only comes from loving someone so much that protecting them feels like hurting them. "What's not fair is that I worked 30 years. 30 years, baby, so that you would never have to fight for what belongs to you. And I will not stand here and watch you hand it to someone you met 4 months ago without so much as a signature on a piece of paper." Enzo stared at her, and for just 1 second something moved across his face. Something that looked like doubt. But then Sienna stepped forward and she slipped her hand into his, and that doubt dissolved the way it always did when she was close. "It's okay," Sienna said softly, looking up at him with those warm, unreadable eyes. "She's just looking out for you. I understand." And that graceful, composed, perfectly timed response should have been reassuring. So why did it feel like a performance? Now here's the thing. To understand how Enzo Bellani, a man this sharp, this careful, this built for strategy, ended up standing in his own penthouse feeling like a stranger in the middle of his own life, we need to go back. Back 4 months, back to the night it all started. Back to when Enzo was just a man who worked too hard, laughed too little, and hadn't let anyone truly close in a very long time. It was a Thursday night in late October, and Chicago was doing what Chicago does in October, biting cold, wrapping around every corner like it had a personal agenda. Enzo had been dragged out by his college friend, a lanky, quick-talking Italian-American named Fiero Mancini, who had decided that Enzo's social life was an emergency requiring immediate intervention. You close a $40 million deal and then come home to eat leftover pasta alone. That's not living, brother. That's just existing in an expensive apartment, Fiero had said, already fixing his collar in the elevator mirror with the confidence of a man who had never once struggled to fill a room. I like my apartment, Enzo replied flatly. The apartment likes you back. That's the problem, Fiero shot back, grinning. And so, against his better judgment, Enzo found himself on the rooftop of a River North bar called Alto, with a glass of aged bourbon in his hand, surveying the city he had spent his entire adult life, building something worthy of. The skyline spread out around them like a declaration. And Enzo, for just one moment, let himself breathe. That was when he saw her. She was standing near the far edge of the rooftop, leaning slightly against the railing, looking out at the city with an expression that was hard to name. Not lonely exactly. More like someone who was used to being surrounded by people but rarely felt truly seen by any of them. She was wearing a deep burgundy wrap dress that moved with the wind, and her dark hair caught the glow of the city lights like she had been placed there deliberately. Like a painting that knew it was being admired but pretended not to care. Enzo was not a man who stared. But he stared. Go talk to her, Fiero said from beside him, not even looking up from his phone. I wasn't, Enzo started. You were, Fiero said simply. And because Fiero was, annoyingly, almost always right about these things, Enzo crossed the rooftop. And that short walk, maybe 20 steps, would turn out to be the most consequential 20 steps of his entire life. You look like you're solving a problem, Enzo said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, looking out at the same skyline. She turned to look at him, and up close her eyes were a deep, warm brown with something quietly alert living behind them. She smiled. Not the performance smile he would come to know later, but something that in that moment felt completely unguarded. Maybe I am, she replied, tilting her head slightly. Or maybe I just like the view. Sienna, she said, extending her hand. Enzo, he replied, taking it. And just like that, it began. Now here's the thing about Sienna Caruso that Enzo didn't know yet and wouldn't know for a long time. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, the daughter of a seamstress mother and a father who left before Sienna was old enough to remember his face. She had watched her mother work 3 jobs, watched the lights get cut off twice one winter, watched opportunity walk past their door like it had the wrong address. And somewhere along the way, Sienna had made herself a quiet, private promise. She was never going back to that, no matter what it took. But that night on the rooftop, none of that was visible. What was visible was a woman who was funny and thoughtful and genuinely curious about the world. She asked Enzo questions about logistics, real questions, smart ones, and she listened to the answers like they actually mattered. She pushed back when she disagreed with him. She laughed at his dry humor in a way that felt earned rather than performed. And by the time the bar announced it last call, 2 hours had passed and neither of them had noticed. I should go, Sienna said, reaching for her jacket. Let me walk you out, Enzo replied. And it wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It was something in between, something that said he wasn't ready for the night to end. She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled. Okay, she said. And that was how it started, slowly and quietly. The way most dangerous things do. Over the next 4 months, Enzo and Sienna became something neither of them had quite planned for. They had dinner at small restaurants where nobody recognized him. They walked along the lakefront on Sunday mornings when the city was still half asleep. She came to his penthouse and cooked pasta from scratch, badly, and they laughed about it for an hour. He told her things about his childhood, about growing up watching his mother carry the weight of the business on her back, about the pressure of inheriting not just a company but an expectation. And Sienna listened. Every single time she listened. But now and then, just occasionally, she asked questions that sat slightly wrong after she left. Questions about the company's structure. About ownership percentages. About what happened to the Billionaire group if something happened to Enzo. He always answered because they felt like curiosity. Because she always asked them so naturally, sandwiched between something warm and genuine, that it never occurred to him to wonder why she needed to know. Little did he know those questions were not curiosity. They were research. But that was still ahead. Because right now, 4 months in, Enzo Billionaire was simply a man who had fallen in love for the first time in years. And he wanted his mother to see what he saw. That was his first mistake. Hey, my people. If this story already has you completely hooked and you can feel exactly where this is heading, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and drop a like on this video right now. And comment below, where in the world are you watching from? We genuinely want to know how far this story is traveling. Now let's get back to Enzo. Because the night he introduced Sienna to his mother was the night the ground beneath him quietly began to shift, and nothing would ever be the same again. Nadia Billionaire arrived at the penthouse on a Friday evening, exactly on time, the way she always was. She had driven up from her home in Hyde Park, the same brick two-story house she had lived in since Enzo was 7 years old. The house she had refused to leave even after the company made her wealthy enough to live anywhere in the world. Because Nadia was not a woman who forgot where she came from. Enzo had spent the whole afternoon nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first major board presentation. He had cleaned the penthouse twice. He had changed his shirt 3 times. And Sienna, watching him from the kitchen island with a glass of wine in her hand and an amused look on her face, had finally said, "Enzo, relax. I'm good with mothers." "You haven't met this one," Enzo replied, straightening a picture frame that was already straight. "She loves you." "I love you. It'll be fine," Sienna said simply, and she took a sip of her wine. And for a moment, Enzo let himself believe that. But then the elevator doors opened, and Nadia walked in, and the temperature in the room dropped by about 10 degrees. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. Nadia greeted Sienna warmly enough, a composed smile, a firm handshake, "It's lovely to meet you." She accepted the glass of sparkling water Sienna offered her. She sat on the couch and asked Sienna polite questions about her work, her background, her family. All very civilized. All very Nadia. But Enzo knew his mother, and he could see it, the way her eyes moved just a fraction too carefully when Sienna spoke. The way she listened not just to the words but to the spaces between them. The way she noted without commenting on the moment Sienna smoothly redirected a question about her childhood into a question about the Billionaire Group's expansion plans. Nadia filed that away like a document she intended to review later. And then Enzo did it. He stood up, reached into the pocket of his jacket, and said, "Actually, Mama, there's something Sienna and I want to share with you tonight." And he looked at Sienna with everything he felt written plainly on his face. And Sienna held out her left hand. The ring caught the light, and Nadia Billionaire looked at it for a long, long moment before she looked up at her son. "You're engaged," she said. "Not a question. A verdict. We're engaged," Enzo confirmed, and there was so much hope in his voice it was almost painful to hear. "I know it's fast, Mama, but when you know, right?" Nadia was quiet for 3 full seconds. And in those 3 seconds, the entire future of the Billionaire family balanced on the edge of a knife. Then she picked up her glass, set it back down, and said very quietly, "If you marry her without a prenup, you will never run this company again." And just like that, the most beautiful night of Enzo's life became a battlefield. "Mama, you can't be serious," Enzo said, and now the hurt in his voice was unmistakable, raw, right at the surface where he couldn't hide it. "I am always serious about the business," Nadia replied, and her eyes were steady, unblinking. "You know that." "This isn't about the business. This is about my life," Enzo said, his voice rising just slightly before he caught it and pulled it back down. "My life, Mama. Not a contract, not a deal. My life. Your life and the business are the same thing," Nadia said simply. "I made sure of that, so that you would always be protected." "Protected?" Enzo almost laughed, but it came out wrong. Too sharp. Too hurt. "You're threatening to take the company from me on the night I get engaged." "That's not protection. That's control." Something flickered across Nadia's face at that word. Control. Like it landed somewhere tender. But she didn't flinch. She just held his gaze and said, "Women who truly love a man do not rush to secure his assets." Sienna, who had been standing very still and very quiet through all of this, now set her champagne glass down on the marble counter with a soft, precise click, and she said in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly warm, "Mrs. Billionaire, I understand your concern. Truly. And if a prenup gives you peace of mind, then I'll sign one. Because Enzo is what matters to me, not the company." It was exactly the right thing to say. It was generous and gracious and mature, and it should have diffused everything. But Nadia looked at Sienna for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "That was very well said. Not thank you. Not I appreciate that. That was very well said." Like she was grading a presentation. Like she had noticed the performance for exactly what it was. And Sienna's smile stayed perfectly in place, but something behind her eyes shifted. Just for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Nadia to catch it. And Enzo, standing between the 2 women he loved most, felt the ground beneath him begin to move. Slowly, quietly, the way it does right before something breaks. So what was really going on behind Sienna's warm brown eyes? And how far was she actually willing to go? Because the story was only just beginning, and the real test hadn't even started yet. The night Nadia Bellani left the penthouse, she didn't slam the door. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. She simply kissed her son on the cheek, told him she loved him, picked up her handbag, and walked to the elevator with the quiet, unhurried steps of a woman who had already decided what she was going to do next. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled Enzo. Because he knew his mother, and he knew that when Nadia Bellani went quiet, she wasn't retreating. She was planning. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window after she left, watching the city below, hands pushed into his pockets, jaw tight. Behind him he could hear Sienna moving around the kitchen, rinsing glasses, putting things away, filling the silence with small domestic sounds that should have felt comforting but somehow didn't tonight. He turned around and looked at her. She was humming softly to herself, her back to him, her engagement ring catching the light every time her hand moved. She looked completely unbothered, and Enzo didn't know whether to feel relieved by that or troubled by it. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," Sienna replied, turning to look at him over her shoulder with a small smile. "She'll come around, you know. Mothers always do." "You don't know my mother," Enzo said, and he meant it as a simple statement of fact. But it came out sounding like a warning. Sienna turned fully now and leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms loosely, studying him with those warm, careful eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I just need her to trust me," Enzo said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I need her to trust that I know what I'm doing." "And do you?" Sienna asked. Softly, almost gently. Enzo looked at her. "Yes," he said firmly. Sienna nodded slowly. Then she uncrossed her arms, walked over to him and pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. "Then that's enough," she said. "We don't need her approval to be happy." And Enzo covered her hand with his and told himself she was right. But that night, long after Sienna had fallen asleep beside him, Enzo lay on his back staring at the ceiling, and his mother's words kept circling back. "Women who truly love a man do not rush to secure his assets." He turned the sentence over and over in his mind like a stone he kept finding in his shoe, trying to figure out if it was wisdom or paranoia, trying to figure out if his mother saw something real or if she was just afraid of losing him. He never found the answer that night, and by morning Sienna was already making coffee and smiling at him across the kitchen island, and the question felt smaller in the daylight. The way fears always do, so he let it go. That was his second mistake. Now here's the thing about the weeks that followed. On the surface, everything looked exactly the way an engagement was supposed to look. Sienna moved the last of her things into the penthouse. They went to dinner with Fierro and his girlfriend, a sharp-tongued, warm-hearted woman named Valentina Cruz who worked in corporate law and laughed too loud and was honestly exactly the kind of energy the table needed. They talked about wedding venues and honeymoon destinations and whether to have a big ceremony or something small and private. And Sienna was wonderful through all of it. She was attentive and funny and warm. She remembered small things. The way Enzo took his coffee, the name of his college roommate he'd mentioned once in passing, the anniversary of the day his father had passed when Enzo was 19. She brought flowers to that particular day without being asked. Just set them on the kitchen counter in the morning and said nothing about it. It broke something open in Enzo's chest. Because that was the thing about Sienna Caruso that made everything so complicated later. She wasn't entirely performing. Parts of her were completely genuinely real. And the real parts were beautiful. And the beautiful parts made it almost impossible to see the rest. But the rest was there, moving quietly underneath everything, like a current beneath still water. It started with small things that Enzo didn't register as significant at the time. Sienna began joining him for morning meetings at the Bellani Group's West Loop offices. Just occasionally at first, she'd bring coffee, sit in on a call, ask a question or two afterward. It felt natural. She was going to be his wife. It made sense that she'd want to understand the business. So Enzo introduced her to his operations director, a meticulous and quietly observant man named Desmond Averill, who shook her hand, smiled politely, and later that same afternoon appeared in Enzo's doorway with an expression that was carefully professionally neutral. "Your fiancé asked me for the last 3 years of quarterly revenue reports," Desmond said, standing in the doorway with a folder held flat against his side. Enzo looked up from his laptop slowly. "What for?" he asked. "She said you asked her to review them," Desmond replied, and his voice was completely flat and completely even in the way that meant he was choosing his words with great precision. Enzo was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask her to review anything," he said slowly. Desmond nodded once. "I know," he said, and he put the folder on the desk and left without another word. Enzo sat with that for a long time. Then he called Sienna. "Hey, did you ask Desmond for the quarterly reports?" he asked, keeping his voice easy and casual. "Oh yeah," Sienna replied, and she sounded completely relaxed about it. "I just wanted to get a better picture of where things stand. Is that okay? I should have asked you first. Sorry, babe. And the apology was so immediate and so easy and so warm that Enzo found himself saying, "No, it's fine," before he'd even decided whether it actually was. But that evening, he opened his laptop and spent 40 minutes going through his recent emails. And he found 3 separate threads where Sienna had been copied in, threads he didn't remember adding her to. Threads about vendor contracts, about an upcoming acquisition, about the restructuring of the company's holding entity. He stared at those emails for a long time, and then he closed the laptop and went to bed. And he told himself there was a reasonable explanation. Because love does that. It gives explanations to things that should be questions. But the questions were piling up, and somewhere across the city in a Hyde Park house with warm yellow kitchen lights, Nadia Billani was also asking questions, quietly, carefully, the way she did everything, because Nadia had not gone home and gone quietly to sleep the night of the engagement dinner. She had gone home and sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and her reading glasses and a legal pad, and she had written down every single thing she had observed about Sienna Caruso in those 40 minutes. Every redirected question, every calculated pause, every moment where Sienna's eyes had moved to the window, to the artwork on the walls, to the square footage of the penthouse, rather than to Enzo's face when he was speaking. She filled 2 pages. And then she made a decision, not a dramatic one, not a loud one, just a quiet, firm mother's decision. She was going to find out exactly who Sienna Caruso was, and she was going to do it herself, without lawyers, without intermediaries, without making Enzo feel like his life was being investigated. Because the moment Enzo felt cornered, he would shut her out completely, and she couldn't afford that. So Nadia waited. She watched. And 3 weeks after the engagement dinner, on a Tuesday afternoon when she knew Enzo had back-to-back meetings until 6, she drove to the penthouse. And she knocked on the door. Sienna opened it, and for just one fraction of a second, just one, something moved across her face that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite welcome. It was something colder than both, but then it was gone, replaced instantly by that practiced warm smile, and Sienna stepped back and said pleasantly, "Mrs. Billani, this is a surprise." "Come in." "Thank you," Nadia said, and she walked in and looked around the penthouse the way she always did, like an assessment, like a woman mentally noting what had changed since the last time she was here. And then she sat down on the couch without being invited to, set her handbag beside her, and looked at Sienna directly. "Enzo isn't here," Sienna said, moving to the kitchen. "Can I get you something? Tea? Water?" "Nothing, thank you," Nadia said. "I didn't come to see Enzo." Sienna paused, just for a breath. Then she turned around slowly and leaned against the kitchen counter. And now the warm smile was still on her face, but her eyes had changed. They were steady and flat and watchful, and Nadia recognized that look immediately because she had worn it herself many times across many boardroom tables. It was the look of someone who was done pretending. "I see," Sienna said simply. "Good," Nadia replied. "Then I won't waste your time." She folded her hands in her lap and said evenly, "I came to tell you that I've decided to accept this engagement, that I've thought about it carefully, and I believe Enzo is happy, and that his happiness matters more to me than my concerns." Sienna blinked, and something shifted behind her eyes, something that looked almost like suspicion being carefully disguised as relief. "That means a lot, Mrs. Billani," she said. "Truly, I'm sure it does," Nadia replied. And then she was quiet for a moment, just long enough for the silence to become slightly uncomfortable. And then she said, very gently, very conversationally, like she was simply making an observation, "You're very good, you know." Sienna's expression didn't change. "Sorry," she said. "At this," Nadia said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the penthouse, at everything. "At making yourself fit, at reading what a room needs and becoming it. It's a real skill." She paused. "I had it too once. When I was your age, and I needed things I didn't have yet." The room was very quiet, and Sienna looked at Nadia for a long moment. And this was the moment everything changed. She dropped the smile. Not dramatically, not with anger. She simply let it go, the way you take off a coat when you're finally inside somewhere warm. And what was underneath it was not ugly exactly. It was just honest. For the first time since Nadia had met her, Sienna Caruso was being honest. "What do you want?" Sienna asked, and her voice was completely different now. Flatter, sharper, the voice of a woman who had grown up with nothing, and had learned very early that pleasantries were a luxury she couldn't always afford. "I want to know what you want," Nadia said simply. "I want to marry your son," Sienna replied. "And the company?" Nadia asked. Sienna smiled then, but it wasn't the warm smile. It was something smaller and more honest, and somehow more unsettling. Security isn't a crime, she said quietly. No, Nadia agreed. But deception is. And she picked up her handbag, stood up, smoothed the front of her blazer, and looked at Sienna one final time. My son loves you, and I think, somewhere under all of this, you might actually love him too. But love without honesty isn't love, baby. It's just a long con. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and then she turned back and said, almost as an afterthought, he deserves to know who you really are, before he finds out the hard way. The elevator doors opened, Nadia stepped in, and as the doors closed between them, Sienna stood in the middle of that beautiful penthouse and stared at the closed elevator doors for a very long time. She was still standing there when her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, read the message, and something crossed her face that Nadia would never see. Something complicated and layered and not entirely cold. Something that looked almost like fear, but also something that looked like resolve. And that resolve was about to push Sienna Caruso into a decision that would reveal exactly who she was underneath everything she had built herself to appear to be. Because what Nadia didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that Sienna had already started making moves. Quietly. Carefully. The way she did everything. She had already had 2 private conversations with a corporate attorney about what spousal rights to a privately held company looked like in the state of Illinois. She had already positioned herself to be copied on key operational emails. And she had already begun, very subtly, building relationships with 2 members of the Billionaire Group's senior leadership team, not through Enzo, but independently. Showing up at industry events. Asking smart questions. Making herself known. She was not waiting for the wedding. She was already building her foundation. And then Nadia went home and called her son. Enzo, Nadia said when he picked up that evening, I need you to come home this weekend. Just you and me. I need to talk to you about something important. There was a pause on the line. Is everything okay, Mama? Enzo asked carefully. Everything is fine, Nadia said. I just miss my son, and I think it's time we talked properly. Another pause. Bring your appetite. I'll make Sunday gravy. And despite everything, despite the anger still sitting in his chest like a stone, Enzo almost smiled, because Sunday gravy was his mother's language for, I love you and I'm scared for you and please just come home. And he understood that language better than any other. Okay, Mama, he said quietly. Sunday. He didn't tell Sienna the full details of the conversation. He just said he was going to his mother's for Sunday dinner, and she should come, and she said she had a prior commitment, and he said okay. And neither of them pushed further, and the space between them, small as it was, widened just slightly. Sunday came, and Enzo sat at the kitchen table in the house he grew up in, with a bowl of pasta in front of him and his mother across the table, and for a little while they just ate and talked about nothing important. About the weather, about an old neighbor who had moved away, about a movie they had both seen years ago. The way families do when they are carefully circling something they need to say. And then Nadia set down her fork, and she looked at her son with the full weight of everything she was. Mother, businesswoman, protector, the woman who had built something from nothing so he would never have to know what nothing felt like. And she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Okay, Enzo said. Do you trust her? Nadia asked. Not love her. Not want her. Do you trust her? Enzo was quiet for a long moment, and his silence was its own answer. I love her, Mama, he said finally. I know you do, Nadia replied. But that's not what I asked. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Baby, I have never once, not one single time in your whole life, steered you wrong, have I? Enzo looked at her hand over his, and something in his chest shifted. No, he said quietly. You haven't. Then I need you to trust me one more time, Nadia said. I have a proposal, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything. Enzo looked up at her. I'm listening, he said. And that was when Nadia Billionaire laid it all out. Quietly, carefully. The way she presented every important proposition she had ever made. She told Enzo that she wanted to make him a bet. That she believed, with everything she had, that Sienna Caruso was not in love with him. That she was in love with what he had. And she told him that the only way to know for certain was to remove the things Sienna was really after, and see what remained. I want to strip it all back, Nadia said. The company, the penthouse, the access, everything. We tell her the business has collapsed, that an audit has revealed massive undeclared liabilities, that you are, for all practical purposes, broke, and then we watch what she does. Enzo stared at his mother. "You want me to lie to the woman I'm about to marry," he said. "I want you to find out if she would stay with the man, not the money," Nadia replied. "Because if she loves you, really loves you, then losing the wealth changes nothing. And if I'm wrong, you get to look me in the eye and tell me so. And I will personally walk her down that aisle myself and never say another word about it." Enzo was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The gravy on the stove bubbled softly. And Enzo Bellani sat there and wrestled with every feeling he had. Love, loyalty, doubt, hope, fear, all of it tangled up together in his chest. "And if you're right?" he asked at last. Nadia looked at him steadily. "Then you'll know," she said. "Before it's too late." Another long silence. And then Enzo picked up his fork, set it back down, and looked at his mother with the eyes of a man who was terrified of the answer but more terrified of never knowing. "Okay," he said quietly. "But we do it my way." And Nadia nodded, because she had learned, a long time ago, that sometimes loving your child means letting them lead, even when it breaks your heart to watch. What neither of them knew was that across the city, at that exact moment, Sienna was sitting in a coffee shop in the West Loop. Across the table from her was her younger sister, Bianca, the only person in the world Sienna truly let her guard down with. And Sienna was talking in a low, urgent voice with her elbows on the table and her coffee going cold in front of her. "She came to the penthouse," Sienna said. "She knows something. I don't know how much, but she knows." "So what are you going to do?" Bianca asked, watching her sister carefully. Sienna was quiet for a moment. And then she said something that, if Enzo had heard it, would have ended everything right there and then. "I'm going to move faster," she said, "before she figures out exactly how much." Bianca stared at her. "Sienna, I know what I'm doing," Sienna said firmly. And she picked up her coffee and took a sip and looked out the window at the Chicago street moving past. And her face was calm and resolved and gave nothing away. But her hands, just slightly, were not quite steady. And here is the thing about people who move fast when they are scared. They stop being careful. And when careful people stop being careful, they leave tracks. And tracks, once found, tell the whole story. So what was Sienna about to do? And was Enzo really prepared for what the test was going to reveal? Because stripping a person of everything they think they love you for is not a small thing. It doesn't just reveal who they are. It reveals who you are too. And Enzo Bellani was about to find that out in a way he never expected. The question was, would he be strong enough to handle the truth when it finally showed up at his door? The plan took 2 weeks to set in motion. Enzo and Nadia moved carefully and quietly the way people do when the stakes are too high to rush. Nadia called her lawyer and had the company's assets temporarily placed into a protected family trust, invisible to anyone outside the inner circle. But on paper, it looked exactly like what they needed it to look like. Like financial collapse. Like everything Enzo had built was suddenly, catastrophically at risk. Desmond Averill, the only other person brought into the plan, quietly pulled Sienna's access to the company's operational emails without explanation. And Enzo went home to his penthouse and stood in the hallway for a full minute before he walked in, composing himself, because what he was about to do required a kind of stillness he wasn't sure he had. Sienna was in the living room when he walked in, curled on the couch with a book, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her feet tucked under her. She looked up when he came in and immediately read his face the way she always did. "What happened?" she asked, sitting up straighter. And Enzo sat down across from her, and he told her that the company's financial records had been flagged in a routine compliance review, that the review had uncovered a series of undeclared liabilities going back years, liabilities predating his leadership, ones his mother had apparently never fully disclosed when she handed him control. He told her that the company's primary lender had already been in contact with the legal team, that the penthouse, held as collateral against a business loan he hadn't even known existed, was now at risk, that his accounts had been frozen pending the outcome of the review. He told her all of it with a steady voice and steady eyes. And inside, his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Sienna stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't say anything at all. And Enzo watched her face. Watched it the way his mother had taught him to watch faces. The way you watch a sky that might be about to change, looking for the thing underneath the thing. "How bad is it?" Sienna asked at last. "Bad," Enzo said simply. "I could lose everything. The company. This place. All of it." Another silence, longer this time. And then Sienna said, "What about your mother? Can't she fix it? It's her mess." And there it was. Not "Are you okay?" Not "We'll figure this out together." Not "I'm not going anywhere." The first question out of her mouth was about the money, about who could fix the money. But Enzo kept his face neutral. "My mother's assets are tied up in the trust," he said evenly. "She can't touch them without triggering a tax event that would make everything worse. We're on our own for now. Sienna looked at him, and something moved behind her eyes, fast and calculating and gone before he could name it properly. Then she nodded slowly and said, "Okay, well, we'll figure it out." And she reached over and squeezed his hand. And Enzo squeezed back. And neither of them said anything else that night. But that night, he lay awake again. And this time, he wasn't staring at the ceiling looking for answers. He was listening, because at 1:17 in the morning, Sienna slipped out of bed quietly, padded down the hallway, and he heard the soft click of the bathroom door closing. And then, muffled, but not muffled enough, the sound of her voice, low and quick and urgent. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the tone. And the tone was not the tone of a woman comforting a worried friend. It was the tone of a woman problem-solving. He didn't move. He just lay there in the dark and listened to the silence after she came back to bed. And he waited for sleep that didn't come. The next morning, Sienna was perfectly normal. She made coffee. She kissed him on the cheek. She asked if he had spoken to his lawyer yet, and he said yes, and she nodded and said to keep her updated. And then she went to get dressed, and Enzo stood at the kitchen counter and stared at his coffee and understood, in the quiet of that ordinary morning, that his mother might be right. But understanding something and accepting it are two completely different things. And Enzo was not ready to accept it yet, so he watched, and he waited, and the days passed. And here's the thing about what happened over the next 2 weeks. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of small ones. Small moments that individually meant nothing but together built a picture so clear it was almost impossible to look at directly. Sienna started asking questions about the prenup, specifically about whether, given the current financial situation, it was still necessary, whether it even made sense to sign a document protecting assets that might not exist anymore. She brought it up casually, lightly, the way she brought up everything uncomfortable, sandwiched between something warm and reasonable so it didn't feel like what it was. But Enzo heard it, and he filed it away. Then she started talking about his mother. At first it was gentle, just observations, just concern. Things like, I wonder if she really understood what she was handing you, and do you think she was fully transparent with you about the company's financial history? Small seeds, planted carefully, designed to shift his trust away from Nadia and towards Sienna, designed to make him feel like the two of them were on one side and his mother was on another. And then one evening, about 10 days into the test, Sienna said something that stopped Enzo cold. They were sitting at the dinner table. The conversation had drifted, the way it often did these days, back to the financial situation, back to the company, back to Nadia, and Sienna was talking about options, about lawyers, about restructuring, about what could be salvaged, and her voice was getting quieter and more focused the way it did when she was thinking hard. And then she said, almost to herself, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud, "You know, if something happened to your mother, all of this would resolve itself. The trust would revert to you automatically." The table went very quiet. Enzo looked up from his plate slowly. "What did you say?" he asked. Sienna looked up too, and for just a moment her eyes were completely unguarded, raw and calculating and stripped of every layer of warmth she had ever performed for him. And then she blinked and the warmth came rushing back and she said quickly, "I just mean legally. In terms of estate planning. That's all." "That's all," Enzo repeated. "Yes," Sienna said. And she picked up her fork again, and her hand was steady, and her voice was even. "I'm just thinking through scenarios." That's all it was. But Enzo had heard it, and he couldn't unhear it, and something inside him, something that had been holding on through all of this, something that had still, despite everything, wanted to be wrong about her, quietly let go. He excused himself from the table, went to the bathroom, stood over the sink with the cold water running and stared at himself in the mirror for a long time. And he thought about the rooftop in River North, about the woman at the railing in the burgundy dress who had looked at the city like she was solving a problem. And he understood now, standing here in his own bathroom with cold water running over his wrists, that she had been. She had always been solving a problem, and he had been the solution. He turned off the tap, dried his hands, and walked back out to the dinner table with a face that gave nothing away. Because Enzo Billionaire had made a decision. Now here's the thing about what happened next. Enzo called his mother that night, not from the penthouse. He stepped out onto the building's rooftop terrace in the cold night air, far from where Sienna could hear, and he called Nadia and told her everything. The late-night phone call, the prenup questions, the slow campaign to turn him against her, and the things Sienna had said at the dinner table. The line was silent for a long time after he finished. "Mama," he said. "I'm here," Nadia replied, and her voice was different from anything he had heard from her in a long time. Not triumphant, Not vindicated. Just tired. And sad. And deeply, completely loving in the way that only mothers can be when they have been right about something they desperately wish they were wrong about. "Baby, I'm so sorry," she said. And Enzo, strong, composed, built for boardrooms Enzo Bellani, stood on that rooftop in the Chicago cold and pressed the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment because he didn't trust his voice. And then he said, "What do we do now?" "We finish it," Nadia said quietly, "properly. So there's no confusion. So she has every opportunity to show you exactly who she is." "And then?" Enzo asked. "And then you decide," Nadia said. "I gave you the test, baby. But the answer is yours." He went back inside, and he and Sienna spent the evening the way they spent most evenings now. In the same space, saying the right things, performing the right gestures, but with a widening gulf between them that neither of them acknowledged out loud. And then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Thursday. Enzo had told Sienna he had an early meeting downtown and would be gone by 7. He left. Or appeared to. He actually parked 2 blocks away, walked back to the building through the service entrance, and rode the elevator up in silence. He had told himself he just needed to know. He needed one final, undeniable moment of clarity. And he was going to get it. He opened the penthouse door quietly. Sienna was on the phone, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window with her back to the door, looking out at the city. The same view Enzo had looked at 1,000 times and called home. Her voice was low and quick, and she hadn't heard him come in. "No, listen to me," Sienna was saying, and her voice was stripped of every softness, every warmth, every carefully constructed layer. This was the voice Nadia had heard glimpses of, but Enzo was hearing it fully for the first time. "The prenup is off the table as long as he thinks there's nothing left to protect. So we wait until after the wedding, and then we file for spousal rights to the business assets. My attorney says that once we're married, the trust restructuring actually works in our favor because—" She stopped, because she had seen his reflection in the glass. She turned around slowly, and Enzo was standing in the middle of his own living room, still in his coat, keys in his hand, looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger. Not hurt. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. Something that looked like the closing of a door. "Enzo," she started. "Don't," he said. "Just that. One word. Quietly." Sienna lowered the phone, and for a moment, just a moment, something genuine moved across her face. Something that wasn't strategy and wasn't calculation and wasn't the performance. Something that looked almost like grief, like she was watching something real slip away, and she knew it, and she couldn't stop it. "It wasn't all fake," she said, and her voice was different now, smaller. "I need you to know that, whatever you think right now, it wasn't all fake." "I know," Enzo said. And he meant it, because he had seen the real parts of her. He had felt them, and that was the part that would take the longest to get over. Not the betrayal, the realness that had lived inside the betrayal, the genuine moments wrapped inside the con. "Then can we?" she started. "No," he said. Still quiet. Still that closed-door voice. "I need you to go, Sienna." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked around the penthouse, at the view, at the marble counters, at the ring on her finger, and something in her expression went through several things at once that were hard to name. And then she set the phone down on the counter, and she walked past him to the bedroom, and 20 minutes later she came out with a bag. She stopped beside him in the hallway, and she looked up at him one last time with those deep, warm brown eyes that had started all of this on a rooftop in River North 4 months ago. And she said very quietly, "You would have been worth it, if I'd let myself believe that sooner." And then she walked to the elevator, and the doors closed, and Enzo stood in the silence of his own penthouse for a long time. He called his mother. She picked up on the first ring. "It's done," he said. Nadia exhaled, long and slow. "Come home," she said softly. "I'll make tea." And Enzo almost smiled. Almost. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He put his keys on the counter, looked out at the city. His city, the one he had built something worthy of, and let himself feel all of it. The loss of what he thought he had, the relief of knowing the truth, the loneliness that was going to live in the space between those two things for a while. But also, quietly, underneath everything, something that felt a little like solid ground returning beneath his feet. Now here's where we pause. Because if you think this is where the story ends, you haven't been paying close enough attention. Because 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, Enzo's phone rang. It was Fierro. And Fierro's voice was strange, tight and careful in a way that Fierro Mancini's voice almost never was. "Hey," Fierro said. "Are you sitting down?" "What happened?" Enzo asked. "I just ran into Valentina's colleague," Fierro said slowly. You know she works corporate law, right? Anyway, her colleague handled a case last year. In Miami. A pause. Enzo, the woman in that case. The description. The pattern of behavior. The way she operated. Another pause. Longer. Brother, I need you to look something up. Right now. Because if what I think is true, if Sienna has done this before, then her walking away 3 days ago was not the end of this story. Enzo's hand tightened around the phone. What are you saying, Fierro? He asked. I'm saying, Fierro replied carefully, that she may have already put things in motion that don't stop just because she walked out the door. Legal things. Things she set up before you ended it. A pause. Things that could still cost you everything. The city glittered outside Enzo's window. Beautiful and indifferent as always. And Enzo Bellani stood in the middle of everything he had built and felt the ground. That solid ground he had just found again begin to move beneath him once more. Because Sienna Caruso had walked out of his penthouse. But had she already taken something with her that he couldn't get back? And was Nadia Bellani, the woman who had seen all of this coming from the very first night, truly prepared for what came next? Remember this. A mother's instinct is rarely wrong, even when it hurts. And love without wisdom is just a beautiful trap. Enzo had learned both of those lessons. But learning a lesson and surviving its consequences are two very different things. And the consequences were just getting started. If you've made it this far, and this story has been living in your chest the way it's been living in ours, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling us who you think Sienna really is deep down. A villain? A survivor? Or just a woman who waited too long to choose the right thing? Because that debate right there, that's the real story, and we need to hear where you stand.